Now, on BBC Radio 4, time for the Moral Maze, live as usual. Here's Michael Berg.
Good evening. It wasn't that long ago, maybe last week, that we used to call a political speech that was blandly uncontroversial all motherhood and apple pie. Not anymore. Fruit tarts may still be safe for the moment, but talking about the advantages of motherhood at the weekend did for Andrea Leadsome's prime ministerial ambitions. The howl went up on Twitter and Facebook about how obnoxious it was in the light of Theresa May's regretted childlessness. So Mrs May's in Downing Street tonight, and Mrs Leadsome has a lot more time to spend with her children than she'd hoped. The politics of offence, identity and rights are becoming ever more complicated and toxic. You can say it's great to have a black president, but not that you'd like a white one. Ditto women. Just when you'd learn to call the sexually ambiguous, or at least transient, transgender, you're told the concept of gender is now unacceptably binary and hence insulting. There are exploding tripwires of social acceptability everywhere, with a new language to describe perceived offensiveness, microaggressions, so-called safe spaces and trigger warnings to protect students from being confronted with ideas they don't agree with, presumably calling them the snowflake generation for their oversensitivity is unacceptably offensive too. It only seems to work one way. Black or brown people can't be racist about whites. Women, if that's not too binary a description, can't be sexist about men. Is all this a good thing? Stigmatising and policing prejudice, protecting the powerless from the powerful? Or are we stifling opinion and debate, making the political personal and identity more important than ideas? When does personal opinion become morally unacceptable? That's our moral maze tonight. Our panel tonight: Claire Fox from the Institute of Ideas, Anne McElvoy, senior editor on The Economist, the chief executive of the RSA, Matthew Taylor, and the priest and polemicist Giles Fraser. Claire, you're out there a lot, strutting your stuff in universities and so on. Do you, what's the phrase? Do you check your privilege first?
Certainly I've been told I need to check my privilege, and what that means is that I have to admit that I have certain advantages over other people because I'm white or because I'm middle class and I'm part of undoubtedly the metropolitan elite and all of that sort of thing. Anyway, I absolutely hate this game because it basically is a way of trying to trump each other by how many suffering points we have, based on not what you've thought or said or achieved, but based on the accidents of birth and skin colour. Ridiculous.
Giles?
Rubbish, Claire. I want to defend political correctness. I think words reinforce and construct patterns of privilege. It's right to watch what you say, especially in a position of power.
Anne?
Well, it is right to watch what you say, but as a broadcaster and writer, I do feel now that there's an increasing number of territories that we have to approach, like nervous horse riders going at a 5-bar gate, and that actually constrains debate. It means we don't really say what we think that way. We don't stretch what we think, and we perhaps don't hear what other people really think. That's even more dangerous.
Matthew?
I've been involved in debates like this before, and I've always before taken what might be kind of termed the politically correct position. But various things about the nature and the impact of identity politics are now causing me a bit of unease, and I want to explore them this evening.
Panel, thanks very much indeed. Our first witness is Maya Goodfellow, who writes for Labour List and Media Diversified, 2 websites, of course, and doing a PhD at SOAS, School of Oriental and African Studies, studying race and racism in Britain. Can you explain to me how it's impossible to be racist about white people or sexist about men?
So I think that we need to realise the difference between prejudice and racism if we're going to talk about racism. So I think prejudice is when you have prejudgments, and that can they don't necessarily reflect real life, but they won't result in limited access to resources or rights. So it won't result in you having trouble to get a job or struggling to get a house. Whereas racism is a form of prejudice, I think, that is based on skin colour that does result in, or can result in, those kinds of limited access to resources. So I think that when we distinguish between racism and more different kinds of prejudice, it's not that we're saying that other forms of prejudice don't matter, it's that prejudice has different outcomes, and the outcomes for racism are very clear and specific and historically rooted.
Matthew Taylor.
Last Saturday in the car, I caught a section of Women's Hour, and Jenny Murray, the presenter, was talking with her guests, and they were discussing why women make better crime writers. And the suggestions that were uncritically discussed included that women understand suffering better, that they're more interested in human nature, and that unlike men, they are capable of thinking with both the left and right side of their brain at the same time. What am I missing when I point out that had the words men and women been transposed in this conversation, listeners would either have assumed it was satirical or deeply offensive?
I don't necessarily think you're missing anything. I think that we have to realise that historically women have been oppressed. We did not have the vote. We don't have equal pay even now. So to think that we are treated equally is untrue. So if we were going to make those comments about men, I guess we would be excluding women from that. But I actually think that is problematic. I think those conclusions that have been drawn are essentialist. They're gender essentialist, and it suggests that women are specifically hardwired a certain way or have certain qualities that we are naturally born with. And I think that's not true. We're socialised in certain ways, and that is clear from the way when we're brought up. We have certain toys, gendered toys, and we're told to act in certain ways. We're told not to speak up when boys are told to speak up. So I think...
So, okay, I get that. What's the kind of end game of this process? So is there going to become a glorious day when the metrics of equality get to the stage where it's actually all right for me to say, well, men tend to be a bit like this and women tend to be a bit like that, and you'll say that's okay because we've reached 95% pay parity? Is that the end game? Or is the end game that we're not allowed to say anything at all about gender predisposition?
I think that we don't want to assume, yes, I think that we don't want to assume that you are hardwired a certain way because you're born a certain gender. And I think that the issue is the conversations that we're having.
I accept that, but I'm a sociologist, and socialisation is part of what makes people. So if socialisation means that women have a certain set of characteristics and men don't, isn't it a reasonable comment about society to say women tend to be like this and men tend to be like that?
Yes, I think that it is, but often it is presented as natural, and that is the problem. We need to accept that we're socialised in certain ways, and often women are presented as, when Theresa May was announced as Prime Minister, it was a lot of people were talking about how women always clear up men's mess, as if we are hardwired to do that. Yes, we're socialised to do that, but it's not naturally ingrained within us.
I get that as well, but isn't this what takes us into this kind of... So it might be all right to say that women are better crime writers than men, as long as I say women are socialised to be better crime writers. So you end up in this situation where as long as I use all the right words, it'll be okay. But isn't that just a terrible minefield?
No, because I don't think it's true that women are better crime writers than men. I think that in and of itself is factually inaccurate. So to make those kinds of... to use those kinds of stereotypes, I think, are untrue and prop up a lot of untruths.
Claire Fox?
I'm just considering identity politics. So I've just written this book called I Find That Offensive. And the thing that drives me mad is when people start every sentence with, as a woman, I find that offensive. Or as a lesbian, I find that offensive. Or as a person of colour, I find it offensive. You know what I mean.
As a book
it goes on
blogger,
and
I
on
find
and
it
on. No, but the reason I'm saying it is because identity is used to try and trump somebody else and silence them. You know, if somebody says... as a woman, I find that offensive, you're meant to shut up. So is identity politics basically the great silencing tool of our time?
No, I don't think that it is. I think that it can be problematic in certain circumstances, as you're saying, if it's used to silence people. But I think what is often done is people are drawing attention to the fact that they have systematically been silenced. So what we need to realise is that we can talk about individuals and we can talk about specific instances, but actually what this is a product of is a system that is unfair.
You've just critiqued essentialism a moment ago. Mm-hmm. So, I mean, when you say they're drawing attention to the fact that they have been systematically silenced, I mean, there is no comparison between, when you say as a woman, does that a Theresa May woman, a Andrea Leadsom woman, a you woman, a me woman? It's different.
No, but I mean, I personally would not say as a woman in that context. What I do think that you're almost critiquing is that we do need to realise that systematically women are disadvantaged. Yes, there are women in positions of power, but there is not pay equality.
So I understand, but I'm talking about. Listen, I understand oppression. You've explained it well. We don't disagree. What I'm trying to say to you is that identity politics is being used as a trump of politics. I mean, we're not having sophisticated discussions about oppression in society at the moment. What we are having is competing identities trying to say what's acceptable to be said and policing ourselves. You know, like people say, you're not allowed to say that about lesbian and gay rights because you're not from the LGBT community. Then that's hopeless, isn't it?
I think that can at times be a self-defeating strategy. But I also think there is some worth in people bringing their own personal experiences into these conversations. So when you do look at Parliament, and yes, I mean, we now do have a woman Prime Minister, but you do look at Parliament and it is predominantly male, it's predominantly white, predominantly middle-aged. So what people are doing, I think, when they're bringing their identity into it, they're trying to call attention to the fact that they are not represented in a proper way. And I think that
representation, the problem is that representation, if you only look at things through the prism of identity, you avoid critiquing them for what they're saying, what their ideas and what their politics are. That's what my critique is.
I agree with that to an extent, but that is to assume that we aren't all judged on certain qualities, that we aren't all judged on being a woman, on being a person of colour, that those things, we carry them with us every day, and we are judged on those criteria consistently.
When you say we carry them with us, it's become fashionable to make a virtue out of producing them as part of your argument, which is actually an essentialising way of reducing politics down to identity.
No, but I think that's untrue, because I think that we do carry it with us. It's not about it being fashionable. The reality is, if you look at race equality today, you have a situation whereby minority ethnic people are 2 times as unlikely to be unemployed, and you have, in certain areas, black people are 17.5% more likely to be stopped and searched. You have research that shows you that white people, if you have a so-called white-sounding name, you will be 2 times as likely to get a job interview than someone if they have a so-called ethnic-sounding name. So these are realities. So people are not wielding these as if they're fashionable.
Maya Goodfellow, thank you very much indeed. Next witness is Dr. Joanna Williams, who's a specialist in the study of higher education and author of Academic Freedom in an Age of Conformity. She's on the line from Canterbury now. Dr. Williams, does identity trump ideas now? Is that what it's about? And what do these new boundaries of acceptability say about us?
Well, I think I do agree that identity trumps ideas, but I'd actually go further. I think identity nowadays actually squashes ideas and puts an end to politics, full stop. I think one other consequence of this that we can see is that not all identities are equal. So feminists have spent decades arguing that we need to have more women represented in positions of leadership so they can act as role models for younger women. And then we get 2 women at the weekend in the runoff for the Conservative Party leadership, and suddenly these are the wrong kind of women. These are just females who happen to be put into a position of power. They're not women that feminists actually approve of. I think one of the consequences of this, and where this takes us, is that we've become unable to separate out the personal from the political nowadays, and we've become unable to separate out things that we disagree with from things that we are insulted by, and we're far too quick to jump to be outraged and jump to be insulted than actually sit down and be able to engage in political dialogue.
I understand. Let me stop you there. Giles Fraser.
I'm rarely outraged by things people say to me, but isn't it important for us to be sensitive to the effect our words have on other people?
I actually think it's patronising and insulting to worry so much about the effect that we might have on somebody by our words that we stop ourselves from saying those words. I actually think it's far more respectful to say what we think and assume that the person we're talking to is able to cope with debate in exactly the same way that we consider ourselves able to cope with debate.
Why do you assume that?
Because I share the same respect for other people as I have for myself. I see other people as being just as intelligent, just as able to cope with the rough and tumble of debate as I am.
What happens if they're not, Dr. Williams? I mean, you're a PhD, not everybody has a PhD, not everybody's an academic. You presume that they're all the same as you, middle-class, white, clever women.
You're asking me to check my privilege?
I am asking you to check your privilege, yes.
I think it's very, very insulting to talk down to people. And I think the biggest way you can talk down to someone is by changing your language and by pretending that you think something that you don't.
But isn't there a difference between talking down and just being sensitive to the effect that your words have on other people? And don't presume that they're like you.
I think you can assume people are different, but you can also assume that people are able to cope with debate and the cut and thrust of debate. I mean, the logic of what you're arguing, where that takes us, is that we protect people from debate. We say these ideas are too dangerous for you. These ideas are too complex for you. And I think we've seen far too much of that in the post-referendum discussion. This idea that the little people can't cope with complex ideas, therefore we better leave these difficult decisions to an elite of academics and politicians rather than troubling people with difficult ideas.
But isn't the sort of conversation you have with other people context dependent? It actually depends upon who you are, who they are, what the nature of the conversation is. The idea that all conversations are conversations between academics like yourself, that's imposing a structure on the conversation that, you know, the other that isn't right, is it?
But I'm not suggesting for 1 second that all conversations take place with academics. I talk to an awful lot of people who are not academics, but I do think all the people I talk to are capable of understanding political ideas. And obviously on a personal level, I don't go around hurling insults at people, but neither do I go around pretending to think things that I don't think, or self-censoring and covering up my thoughts and my beliefs. I mean, the logic of what you're saying would be to suggest that Andrea Leadsom shouldn't have said what she said about motherhood.
No.
Now, I disagree with what Leadsom said, but I would much rather that she'd said it so that we all know what she thinks.
Anne McElroy?
I wondered if I could take you back to your assertion about political ideas being perhaps blurred by our focus on personality. Isn't it true that from ancient Greece and Rome through to the post-Brexit Tory and Labour parties, the public does rightly look at politicians and see their character, their personality, whether they think they're trustworthy or even likeable, as important? What's wrong with that?
Well, I think you're right, and I think there's always a tendency in human nature to do that. But I think the problem nowadays is twofold. I think, firstly, the character, the personality, if you like, has come to replace politics. So politics has become completely subsumed. The character bit is not an aside.
Well, let me give you an example. When I wrote a sketch, on Andrea Leadsom and Theresa May, the Conservative Party's search for someone to sort it out, talking about call for mummy. Would I be wrong, because I was obviously using types there, but I was interpreting what I saw or feeling that I felt that was there in the Conservative Party, and the readers would know pretty much what I meant. What's wrong with that?
Well, I think the problem is it's not focusing on the ideas that these women might have to put forward.
Well, I can write something else about that. Why is it inherently wrong? You see what I mean? I understand that you want more focus on ideas, and I like a nice, chunky policy debate as much as you do. Mm-hmm. But I wonder whether you're just being perhaps a little kind of holier than thou when you don't want us to have a discussion about types that is... It's what democracy lives and breathes.
Mm-hmm. No, it's not so much that I don't want us to have a discussion about this. I do think other things are far more important. But I think the second problem I was alluding to is that it makes it very difficult then for people to separate the personal from the political. So the political nowadays becomes, in effect, a moral virtue signalling. And again, I think this is something that we very much saw in the run-up to the referendum.
OK, can I just break in? Because one last thought from you probably before you disappear. You talk about virtue signalling there. Now, there's a phrase we wouldn't really know what it meant a few years ago. The other one might be microaggressions, the idea that if something, if a number of attitudes come together, we should call people out, and even if they don't appear to be saying them very openly. In a way, we do know what that means. So what's wrong with having these words, microaggression, virtue signalling? There's nothing wrong with it, is there?
There's nothing wrong with the words, but there's everything wrong with what those words stand for, because actually what those words are meaning is censor yourself, check yourself, don't say what you think, don't express your real opinions in public, don't engage in political debate.
You don't think society's the better for us checking ourselves just a little?
Absolutely not. I think it becomes conformist, it becomes stifling, it takes politics away from people, it replaces politics with identity, it prevents debate from taking place in society, and I think certainly at this moment in time, we need far more debate than ever before.
Dr. Williams, thank you very much indeed. Our next witness is Peter Tatchell, who, of course, made his name as a gay rights activist, but now campaigns more generally on human rights issues. But even you've fallen foul of this stuff, haven't you? You've been accused, fairly, I'm sure, of bigotry, racism and transphobia. If it happens to you, what hope for the rest of us?
Well, precisely, particularly when there was no evidence ever presented for those allegations. I think that shows how some strands of perhaps well-intentioned politics sometimes go off the rails.
Ah, well, you don't feel responsible for that?
Why should I be responsible for false allegations against me?
No, I didn't mean that. I meant for the more general atmosphere. Claire Fox.
Well, let me try and untangle some of that. Could you, Peter, reflect on, the difference between contemporary identity politics, which I think we can see is proving to be quite problematic and divisive and so on, and historically, people like yourself who would have said, I, as a representative of gay men or whatever, and a lot of the political campaigns of the past, I suppose, were a kind of forerunner of identity politics. I mean, is there any connection there between what's happening?
Well, I put my hands up and say very proudly that I was one of the great champions of identity politics 40 years ago, 50 years ago, in fact. And that was because in those days, women, ethnic minority people, lesbians and gay men, disabled people and others were totally excluded from the public discourse and political debate. The mainstream parties did not address the very severe discriminations that those communities faced. So we absolutely had to defend and assert our identities in order to champion a fairer deal. What I think has to some extent gone wrong is, as your previous speakers have alluded to, is that identity is increasingly being used as a weapon to either denigrate or silence people because of their particular, traits or background. Now, I believe that a good idea is a good idea, regardless of who proposes it or what their background is. Just because someone is a straight white male doesn't mean to say automatically their idea is invalid. They should be judged on the content of what they say, not on those characteristics.
But just in terms of how people kind of understand this, you can't transcend your identity any longer because that becomes the most important feature of any discussion. But
well, it shouldn't. It
no,
shouldn't.
I know, but I'm saying that's
identity should be just one strand of who we are.
Right. So then. How do you think this will end up in a way? Because if you've got a situation because it's not just used. I mean, think about linguistic policing at the moment. I mean, I'm almost frightened to have this conversation because I know I'm going to say something wrong. I mean, I have to use the phrase now, people of colour, which, by the way, is the politically correct phrase. It sounds so awkward and ugly to me, but, am I allowed to say ethnic minorities? I said Asian the other day and I felt nervous. I thought somebody might shout at me. I mean, this kind of... I was going to say, who do you think decides what is the correct thing? Can I call you queer? Is that right or not?
I think you've raised a very important issue, and that is intention. It's not necessarily what someone says, but what their intention was. So I'll give you an example. A woman who'd recently arrived in Britain from Eastern Europe used the term coloured and was held down and criticised and effectively accused of being a de facto racist. Where she came from, there'd never been a debate about these linguistic terms. And she, on discussion afterwards, she actually used the term coloured to be inclusive, to refer to Caribbean, African, Arab, Asian, Chinese and other people. Yet she was totally humiliated and was almost in tears. Now that is perhaps an extreme example, but that is an example of where sometimes this kind of politics leads. And I think it's really profoundly wrong. You have to judge someone on what they intended. Right. And if they've made a mistake, be ready to forgive and to educate rather than punish. I think so much of this identity politics is about punishing people who make mistakes. Yeah. And I'm in favour of redemption. I think we want to try and persuade and win over people and get them to recognise what they said was inappropriate and help them, encourage them towards using the language that is inclusive and non-abusive.
Can I just ask you a very quick question? Is there a bit of hypocrisy around? I noticed people calling people who voted Brexit, for example, racist. They were saying they're pond life in one debate I was in, pond life and slime and knuckle dragging. It's okay to be bigoted about them and not others. How do you feel about that kind of double standard?
Well, of course it's double standards. And, if we want that language used about us, we shouldn't use it about others. We need to have a civilised discourse. We can have a civilised discourse. We can have strong, robust opinions, but do it in a polite, civilised way.
Matthew Taylor? Can
I pick up this, the reference to Brexit? I suspect there was an element of the Brexit vote which was kind of two fingers up to the Liberal establishment.
Absolutely, I agree.
And I think a lot of the people who did that, one of the things they would say if you spoke to them is they felt that they're not allowed to say what they think. Does it worry you that so many people feel that, or do you think that's just them kind of succumbing to myth?
I think it partly is myth. It partly is an exaggerated reflection of how some people feel. But I've got to say that although there undoubtedly were some racist and xenophobic people who supported Brexit for those reasons, I think, as you say, a lot of people did so because they wanted to send a message to the political elites of all parties who'd ignored them for decades, who left them rotting in decaying inner city areas or remote rural communities without proper facilities and services. Right. And they wanted to say, we've had enough.
And isn't this part of the problem that we're discussing here, which is that you talked about intentionality, and I wonder whether what has happened is that, in a sense, the assumption we've drawn is that if certain communities say things about immigrants, there's the intentionality underlying that must be bad, whereas other people might say the same kind of thing, and we think, well, no, you're one of us. So if we're going to judge people by intention, how do we work out what the intention is?
Well, I think we have to, talk to them and analyse what they've said and how they've said it and the context. All those things are really important. It's not just who says what; it's the context, the intention, the circumstances. And I think really the response, there is an undercurrent of real racism. We've seen the report that racist attacks have increased by 400% since the Brexit vote, which is really, really shocking. But I think one of the ways to deal with that is to, first of all, we have to challenge that racism, and indeed any other prejudice, because we want to live in a kind, gentle society.
Shouldn't we also have said much earlier it was okay for people to express concerns about specific impacts of migration on labour markets or public services? No, that isn't inherently racist. And didn't we spend too long labelling those positions as unacceptable?
In many cases, yes. And I think, the failure to address the intense marginalisation and deprivation faced by sections of our communities, black and white, is a really huge political failure, which has given an opening to the expression of these racist sentiments. So we have to address the racist sentiments. We've got to address the underlying issues that may have driven some of those people to badly and mistakenly scapegoat minority communities.
Peter Tatchell, thanks very much indeed. Our last witness is Josh Howie, who's a stand-up comedian who's just incidentally recorded his own Radio 4 series, Josh House's Losing It, which will be broadcast next month. You push pretty hard at some of these boundaries, don't you? Are you playing with fire?
Yeah, absolutely. And I personally quite enjoy it, as long as I don't get burnt, I should say. But following on from what Peter said, in certainly in comedy terms, it's absolutely about context and intent in terms of placing a joke within the wider subjects that you're talking about, and also what exactly is the underlying message behind that joke. And most jokes do have meanings beyond their original...
And intentions.
Yeah.
Anne McElroy.
I see you've been praised by one critic as venturing into the tripwire ground of race and religion, and it has that sort of, he's a very naughty boy feeling behind it, that sort of comment. But at the same time, you talk yourself as being comedy in a safe space, as if you're giving us a kind of permission to laugh at things we're otherwise not allowed to laugh at.
Well, that's exactly what comedy is, I think, in a lot of ways, is dealing with taboos and doing it in, we've used the word safe space stuff, but this is a different kind of safe space. But it also, comedy can be used to push things a bit further. And for me, the favourite kind of laugh I get would be between that moment between the punchline and the laugh. If there's like an intake of breath, it's that moment where people, I think, are sort of reassessing what their own position is on something. They're actually having to go, wait a minute, is it okay for me to laugh at that? Hopefully, yes, they do. And I think
so just to pick up your phrase there, is it okay to laugh? Does that not worry you? I mean, if you have this desire to be a bit of a naughty boy, why do we need your your permission to be naughty?
Well, you don't need my permission, but I think it's some people want to go out to be challenged a little bit. And when I was doing anthropology, it was always this analogy of the two hands clapping. You have to come up against something else to find out sometimes what your own position on matters are. And I mean, I'm not ever trying to offend anyone. I'm just trying to wind people up a bit.
Do you find
A neat distinction.
Yeah, just start with the panel here. Do you find other comedians offensive sometimes?
Yeah, I do, and I hope that doesn't make me a hypocrite.
I'm just wondering.
Yeah, maybe I'm a hypocrite then. Yeah, there's the French comedian Dieudonné, if I'm pronouncing it correctly, and what he says offends me, but I don't see him now as a comic. Almost, I think he's almost stating political positions. And I think also the other thing to look at is who, in terms of intent and breaking that down a little bit, who is your audience and who's the victim of the joke.
Just quickly on who is your audience, a man who wore a T-shirt mocking the reaction of his Liverpudlian workmates to Hillsborough lost his job and ended up in court. Now, you could say, well, that's context, or you could say that he was taken to task and suffered for something that you don't say you would make the same joke, but that you get away with transgressing because you have the safe space of the stage. The ordinary civilian doesn't. Why not?
Well, because I think he was a bit of an idiot. To be honest, that was a pretty...
That'll do.
It's a moral category. It's a bit vague.
Are we offending anybody here?
No, nobody at all.
Show about offence.
Giles Fraser, fresh from Liverpool, indeed. Watch your words now, Giles.
I'm trying to get this boundary business, which is really interesting to me.
I'm still trying to get the boundary business.
Okay, so let's just try and do it together. So you're often described as a Jewish comic. I don't know if you like that or not. So often people say only Jews can tell Jewish jokes. Do you think that's right?
No, not at all. I mean, I talk about all ethnicities. I talk about...
So you'd be happy with someone with UKIP, say, saying the same joke, the same material?
Okay, so this goes into the intent element. Who's the audience to? If it's a UKIP member doing it to a UKIP audience, and who's the victim of the joke? If the victim of the joke is Jews, then of course I'm going to get offended. But if it's trying to play with
the same material can be offensive in one context and non-offensive in the other.
Yeah, I believe so. Yeah.
And when you get that sharp intake of breath, which you're talking about, and I completely understand that, what do you think people are psychologically assessing in that split second between the sharp intake of breath and the laugh?
I think it goes down to the core of what their own position is, because for that one moment, they're alone with whatever in their own little bubble of if is it acceptable or not. And when the laughter starts, you can sort of almost those bubbles breaking down as people kind of get, and they're all in on that same joke. Hopefully, if I've done my job right.
But I was only joking. Is also the excuse of playground bullies.
Oh, absolutely. Well, you had
you
had John McDonnell this morning claiming that with his sort of it was using the
it's just a joke after you say something
it was
incredibly...
at a stand-up night. Yeah, absolutely.
And I'm still not confident I've understood the difference between when it's okay and when it isn't.
Well,
and I know you're playing with that difference.
All I can assure you is that I do.
And that's because you're a good person.
Yeah, absolutely.
And your
I'm
audience is good people as well.
No, not necessarily. And I think in a weird way, sometimes the experience that I've come across is that because I'm deliberately trying to sort of wind up fellow Guardian reading middle class people, they're my sort of audience, that actually that sometimes the people who actually do get offended might be people with genuine racist
but isn't that partly the point?
feelings.
You're sort of winking at people going, I don't really mean this, I'm a Guardian reader, you're all Guardian readers, we're all in this together. And so actually that nothing's, you're not being that dangerous.
Well, that's why I actually, when I'm working in new material, for me the test is, would I do this joke in front of whoever it is that I'm actually talking about? And again, playing to who actually the victim of the joke is, and usually it's me.
Have you ever gone too far? Have you ever done it when you've gone, actually, I'm slightly ashamed that I crossed the boundary? I mean, you're playing with boundaries,
I have
presumably
once, and I don't want to talk about it. But I did, yes.
Go on, tell us. That's really important. That's exactly what we're here for.
I did. No, I know afterwards it was a remark that came out. It was something to do with being Jewish, and I was not. It was a new material night, and I was improvising with someone in the audience, and as soon as I said it, it got a massive laugh, and I felt shame, and I was like, right, and it got a huge laugh, and I was like, no, I'm never saying that again.
Did you apologise?
To myself.
Well, that's all right then. Josh Howie, thanks very much indeed. Can I take you back to our first witness, Maya Goodfellow? I asked him why, to explain exactly why it was impossible for a black person to be racist about white people, or women to be sexist about men, and she answered with a distinction which I didn't quite follow between prejudice and racism, but it had something to do with historic power structures. I think a real argument.
I understand the point, and the point is that racism is prejudice plus power, and so therefore it can't. I mean, so let's not go through our arguments again. But I think that what I felt about listening to her is I actually didn't disagree with anything that she said. But I thought these ideas are almost impossible to understand unless you spend your life in discussing these kinds of questions. And for me, one of the criteria for a political idea is that it's something that people can understand. If a political idea is something that you can't understand unless you're steeped in that area, it's a problematic idea for me.
Giles?
No, I mean, I thought she was making. It's a really clear distinction, it seems to me. Okay, we can all have preconceived ideas about other people, and that can be, that can be mistaken or so forth. But there are also preconceived ideas that put people down who has historically themselves been put down, and that's a different sort of thing. That's the difference between the white president and the black president example that you gave.
Yeah, Claire?
I actually thought that she started to get into contradictory territory, because she actually understood something of the dangers of essentialising people to their identity. She mentioned the word essentialism, but she actually then went on to do exactly that very thing, it seemed to me. And although she kept saying, yes, I know the danger of doing that, but on the other hand, I think it's important that we are able to draw attention to the historic plight of women when we talk. It's like sort of, so basically you as an individual, in order to kind of get yourself into, in a position where you can be heard, in a way, rather arrogantly, subsume all of the struggles of your particular gender or so it's like I'm always very tempted to say, as an Irish person, you can't possibly say that to me, because, I went through the famine, and you know what I mean? I mean, you don't know what it's done to me, right? I mean, and you're laughing. No, don't you laugh. I mean, the thing is, I've been in arguments with people, they've done it to me, and I'm like sitting there thinking, I'm going to laugh. And then I start saying, well, I'm Irish too, and I think, God, I'm even doing it as well.
I think you're just difficult, but I do think what she was an interesting argument. I did follow that division between, is there just a prejudice that is, prejudice might be unpleasant, and what you actually suffer from. I thought it was pretty much a straightforward Marxist analysis in the end. But I do think Claire had a point on the essentialism, such a catchy phrase. She was basically wanting us to see history, or to see allocation of resources, as she kept putting it, exactly the way that she did. Now, of course, people will differ on that. Reasonable people will differ on what they think is important, what matters more. That will go a bit whether they're of one political persuasion or other, or it may just be how they see the world. So what you lose in that view is the fact that it might be a bit of one thing, it might be a bit of another, and how do you interpret that?
Well, I agree, and I think, you see, for example, it seems to me that she's asserting, her view is that in a world of absolute equality there would be no gender differences. Now, that is a very debatable proposition. Indeed. If we get into a world where anybody who doesn't agree with her about that debatable proposition is somehow deemed to be offensive, we're in a very difficult world.
Or also privileged. I mean, that's the thing, is where it'd be like sort of, you don't know because I'm the woman and I understand it because of, and you think, no, it's a political analysis, let's discuss it as that.
There was an interesting and absolute contradiction between the two people, if you like to see it in that way, the two witnesses who were on that side of the argument. There was Maya Goodfellow, who said that, almost in terms, that identity politics was not a means of silencing people. And Peter Tatchell, later in the programme, who absolutely said, yes, it was now being used as a weapon to silence people.
But the fact that it can be used that way doesn't mean that it's always used that way. I think identity politics, now people just rubbish identity politics. I think identity politics means that you bring your whole self to discussions about politics, and your whole, it can mean all sorts of things, but that's partly, it is about, politics is the personal as well, and it doesn't have to shut everybody up. It doesn't have to be used in the way that you're saying, Claire, with, I am X, so you can't speak to me like that. But you bring your history and your present into those discussions.
But Giles, in terms of the people, your parishioners, for example, do you not kind of see that for people who are kind of liberal and sophisticated, who know what it is to say, that they're okay in this world, but do you not recognise that a lot of other people feel very nervous, that they feel that what they're saying is being policed, and that, for example, was the reason why for many people didn't feel they could talk about worries about migration without being called racist.
Completely right. I completely agree with you. So the way in which it's often used to shut people up, that's inappropriate, but it doesn't have to be used that way.
Sorry.
He did put in a great defence, I thought, of identity. His foregrounding of identity politics actually was rather good these days to get someone to just come out and go, yeah, I mean, I was that guy. I thought what was interesting at the end, and perhaps we all do this, and I found myself actually with a couple of the witnesses saying, nodding along and then going, hang on, no, and I don't agree with that. Maybe some listeners feel the same. I felt when he tipped over, we got back to that old kind of core that says, oh, if you feel this way, it must be because you're marginalised. So you begin to get that view that the only reason that people do certain things, and Brexit hangs around a bit in this territory, they must be terribly, terribly marginalised. Some people who vote because they are. A lot of people may have other reasons, and they may not be so despairing.
Dr. Williams was pretty clear in her criticism of all this, and said outright at the beginning of her appearance on the programme that this identity politics squashes ideas and puts an end to politics, she said.
Let me come back on this because it sort of fits in with what I was going to say to Giles earlier. So I think that what she's saying is identity politics isn't just, Giles can't just say, I think identity politics is this over here. It's a very real political movement at the moment that's theorised and has proponents of it, and you can be a victim of it. And at least I thought Joanna Williams was trying to explain the contemporary period and what exists. So you can sort of say, oh, it's about bringing your whole self to the party. The truth of the matter is that it's has a ghettoising effect. It also emphasises difference.
Did she overstate that?
And I don't think. I thought she had with anything.
Condescension and insult and all that sort of thing.
Yes, I think it's incredibly stifling, and I also think that you're not encouraged to transcend your difference.
It's
That's
stifling.
the point. You're meant to celebrate
old
it.
didums is what I want to say to people when they say it's stifling. It's just like, I mean, now you sound like the snowflake generation here. It's like, okay, people say to you, you can't say that sort of thing. Well, you can keep on saying it. That's okay. No one's actually literally stopping you. We're still having the debate. And she was complaining, all these people making me feel terribly bad because I say
people
this
get
and that.
Sacked.
Well,
people get demonised, and people get witch
I agree with you about that. I agree with you about that. But I think that people can say what they like, and you can also include your whole self and where you come from in political discussions. The idea that becomes inappropriate or inadmissible is ridiculous. It's another form of censorship.
I thought she conflated two different ideas. The one was the one we're talking about, which is the notion of people saying you're not allowed to say that. But the other was a broader argument, which is, in a sense, we shouldn't at all be interested in people when we talk about ideas. And I think that's unrealistic. And also I think it's a bit, actually I think who people are is a relevant part of how we talk about and think about politics.
And the last two witnesses, in fact, Josh Howie and Peter Tatchell, talked a lot about context and intentionality.
They did. Context and intentionality are very reasonable categories to bring to this debate. I did think that I'm going to focus on Josh Howie, if I may. I thought he was extremely entertaining. I thought he did show that he thought an awful lot about what he was doing when he was going through these tripwire territories. Ultimately, he was intellectually in quite a safe space, wasn't he? I wasn't sure that he was as comfortable with anyone doing what he did if they weren't of his worldview.
Claire, 10 seconds.
He felt, as a Guardian reader, that he could talk to Guardian writers and readers, but he didn't think that UKIPs telling the same joke to the same material to a UKIP audience should be allowed. Very liberal, very Guardian.
Oh, yeah, stick it to the Guardian. That's it for this week. From our panel, Anne McElvoy, Claire Fox, Matthew Taylor and Giles Fraser, and from me. Until the same time next week, remember, mum's the word. Good night.
The Moral Maze was chaired by Michael Burke and produced by Phil Peagum. You can download The Moral Maze from the BBC Radio 4 website.